"You can't live here." Those were the exact words that came out of the HOA president's mouth as she stood on my porch, clipboard in hand, her voice dripping with that smug authority only someone drunk on power can carry. I was halfway through fixing the hinges on my cabin door when she marched up the steps like she owned the place. My cabin, my land, my family's property for 3 generations. And now this woman was telling me I didn't belong here? I laughed at first, thinking it was some kind of joke. But then she held up a stack of papers and declared that I was in violation of multiple HOA housing regulations. That's when I realized this wasn't a joke. This was a war. And here's where the first twist comes in. Buried in the HOA bylaws, we found something Margaret clearly hoped no one would ever notice. The HOA only had jurisdiction over common areas and shared amenities. You know, roads, docks, the community park. Individual cabins? Private property. They could suggest standards, but they had no legal teeth to enforce most of the nonsense Margaret was throwing at us, which meant all those fines, the eviction threat, the violations. They were as empty as Margaret's smile. She was bluffing, and I wasn't about to let her keep bluffing. Now here's the kicker. The HOA wasn't even around when my grandfather built this place. The neighborhood association formed decades later, when developers started adding more cabins around the lake. At first, it was meant to preserve community standards. You know, making sure lawns didn't get overgrown and boats weren't abandoned by the shoreline. Reasonable stuff. But over the years, it turned into something else. A monster. By the time I moved in permanently, the HOA had become infamous for handing out fines like candy, dictating paint colors, even controlling what kind of curtains people could hang in their windows. And at the top of it all was Margaret, the president. Imagine a woman in her late 60s, always dressed in a stiff pastel blazer, clipboard glued to her hand, lips pursed like she had swallowed a lemon. She wasn't elected as much as she had simply stayed. Nobody dared challenge her, because anyone who did found themselves drowning in violation notices. The first shot she fired at me seemed small, a note taped to my cabin door claiming that my porch swing was non-compliant. Non-compliant. It had been hanging there since my grandfather's time, but I shrugged it off, thinking it wasn't worth the fight. Then came another notice. This time about my firewood pile being improperly stacked. Then one about the color of my shutters. And finally, the big one, a formal letter stating that my cabin was not up to HOA habitation standards, and that I would need to vacate until it was rectified. In other words, she was trying to evict me from my own property. I can't even explain the mix of emotions I felt reading that letter. Anger, yes, but also disbelief. Who was this woman to tell me I couldn't live in my own cabin? This wasn't some rented condo or a subdivision where the HOA actually owned common property. This was my land, my deed, my taxes. Yet here she was, acting like she held the keys to my front door. I spent that night pacing the living room, staring at my grandfather's old photographs on the mantel. And I made myself a promise. If Margaret wanted a fight, then a fight she would get. And I wasn't going to swing blindly. I was going to strike where it hurt most, her supposed authority. Margaret didn't waste time. The day after that eviction notice landed, I woke up to find bright orange violation stickers slapped on my cabin windows. Big, ugly ones, like the kind you see on condemned buildings. Except my cabin wasn't condemned. It wasn't unsafe. It wasn't even out of code. She wanted the whole neighborhood to see those stickers and believe I was living in some kind of unsafe shack. And you know what? For a moment it worked. I caught neighbors staring, whispering, even shaking their heads as they walked by. Margaret had weaponized embarrassment, hoping I'd slink away quietly. But slinking away isn't in my nature. I peeled those stickers right off, marched them down to her pristine little HOA office, shed by the lake, and slapped them onto her window. When she stormed outside, red-faced and hissing about property defacement, I just smiled and said, "You put trash on my windows. I figured you'd want it back." The look on her face was priceless, but I knew it was only going to escalate things further. Sure enough, the fine started rolling in. $50 for unsightly porch furniture. $100 for excessive wood storage. $200 for non-compliant paint color. Every week, like clockwork, another notice arrived. And every week, I filed them away in a neat folder labeled Margaret's Madness. I wasn't paying a dime until someone with real authority told me to. Still, I'd be lying if I said it didn't get under my skin. Walking through my own neighborhood felt like stepping into enemy territory. Margaret's allies on the board, 3 retirees who loved nothing more than sipping iced tea on her porch and nodding along to her speeches, would glare at me from across the street. If I waved, they'd turn their backs. If I parked my truck, they'd walk over to measure how close I was to the curb. Petty, relentless harassment. That's when I decided I needed allies of my own. I started talking to my neighbors, the ones Margaret had burned in the past. There was Sarah, who had been fined for hanging a bird feeder too close to the road. There was Ben, whose boat cover was apparently the wrong shade of blue. And there was Mrs. Jenkins, a sweet old lady who'd been forced to repaint her shutters twice in a single year because Margaret claimed the shade was fading unevenly. Every single one of them had a story, and every single one of them was sick of Margaret. We began meeting casually, coffee on Sarah's porch, beers by the lake with Ben. What started as venting sessions turned into strategy talks. Because if Margaret wanted to play the rulebook game, then maybe it was time we read the rules a little closer. And here's where the first twist comes in. Buried in the HOA bylaws, we found something Margaret clearly hoped no one would ever notice. The HOA only had jurisdiction over common areas and shared amenities. You know, roads, docks, the community park, individual cabins, private property. They could suggest standards, but they had no legal teeth to enforce most of the nonsense Margaret was throwing at us, which meant all those fines, the eviction threat, the violations. They were as empty as Margaret's smile. She was bluffing, and I wasn't about to let her keep bluffing. So, the next time Margaret strutted up my porch with her clipboard, I was ready. She started rattling off some nonsense about my chimney not meeting HOA smoke emission standards. I cut her off mid-sentence and handed her a copy of her own bylaws, highlighted and tabbed. "You don't have authority over my cabin, Margaret. This says so in black and white." The way her mouth opened and closed, like a fish gasping for air, was almost comical. Almost, because after a long pause, she smirked and said, "Well, maybe not yet, but rules evolve." Then she turned on her heel and stormed off. That's when I realized she wasn't going to stop. If she couldn't beat me with the rules she had, she'd try to make new ones. And that's when it hit me. The county. See, Margaret could bully us with HOA notices all day long, but she couldn't outrank county inspectors. And if she wanted to play the code compliance card, why not let the real professionals come in and take a look? I made a few calls, explained that the HOA president was claiming my cabin was unsafe, uninhabitable, and in violation of housing standards. The inspector on the other end sounded almost bored at first, until I mentioned the words fraudulent fines and harassment under the guise of code enforcement. Suddenly, I had their attention. They scheduled a full inspection for the following week. Margaret wanted a war. Fine. I was bringing in reinforcements. The morning the county inspectors arrived, Margaret must have smelled it in the air. She was already loitering at the edge of my property, clipboard clutched like a weapon, lips pinched tight. I could almost hear her rehearsing lines in her head. Unsafe chimney. Non-compliant wiring. Hazardous living conditions. She was hoping the inspectors would march right in and back up every bogus claim she'd made. What she didn't know was that this wasn't just about my cabin anymore. This was about exposing her whole game. When the county truck pulled up, 2 inspectors stepping out in hard hats and reflective vests, Margaret swooped in like a hawk. "Oh, thank goodness you're here," she started, already pointing at my cabin like it was a condemned check. "This man has been endangering the community. Unapproved structures, dangerous modifications. The list goes on." I let her rant. Then, when she finally took a breath, I said calmly, "Gentlemen, welcome. Please inspect everything, top to bottom." And inspect they did. They checked the foundation, the wiring, the chimney, the plumbing, the smoke detectors. Every inch of that cabin got a professional once-over. Margaret trailed behind them like a shadow, jabbing her finger at things she didn't understand. "See that? The porch railing. Unsafe." One inspector measured it, nodded, and said, "It's perfectly within code." Margaret's face twisted. She tried again. "What about the solar panels? Those aren't permitted." The inspector checked the installation paperwork I handed him. Permits signed, sealed, and filed years ago. "All legal," he confirmed. Every time she thought she'd scored a point, the inspectors swatted it down with facts. And I just smiled, hands in my pockets, watching her unravel. Finally, after nearly 2 hours, the lead inspector gathered his notes. Margaret leaned in, practically salivating for bad news. "Well," she demanded. The inspector cleared his throat. "This cabin is in excellent condition. All modifications are permitted. There are 0 code violations here." I swear you could have heard a pin drop. Then he added the kicker. "In fact, if anyone is misrepresenting authority here, it would be the HOA. They don't have jurisdiction over this property." He turned to me. "Sir, if they continue harassing you, you may want to file a complaint." Margaret's jaw fell open, so wide I thought it might hit the dirt. The inspectors packed up, shook my hand, and drove off. That should have been the end of it, right? Oh no. Margaret wasn't going to slink away in defeat. Not her. She came storming up my steps, finger wagging, voice trembling with rage. You set me up. You think this changes anything? We'll just change the bylaws. We'll vote. You'll see." I stared at her for a long moment, then said softly, "Margaret, you can't evict someone from their own land. You've been bluffing this whole time, and everyone's starting to see it." Her face flushed crimson. "We'll see who's bluffing," she screeched before storming off down the trail. And that's when I realized she wasn't just angry. She was scared. Sure enough, the next HOA meeting was chaos. Margaret tried to ram through her amendment to give the HOA control over private cabins. She barked about protecting community values and ensuring safety standards. But for the first time, people weren't nodding along. They were asking questions. Real questions. "Margaret, why are we trying to regulate cabins when the county already does inspections? Why are we paying fines for nonsense when our dues are supposed to maintain the park? Why did the county inspector say you had no authority over private land?" Her allies fidgeted. Her loyalists stayed quiet. And me? I just sat in the back row, arms folded, letting the truth sink in. That's when I dropped my ace. When the floor opened for comments, I stood and pulled out the thick folder I'd been compiling. Every bogus fine, every violation notice, every photo of stickers she'd slapped on my windows. Then I pulled out the county's written inspection report. 0 violations, cabin fully up to code. "Neighbors," I said, holding the papers high, "this is proof. Margaret has been abusing her position. She's fined us for things outside her authority. She's threatened evictions she has no power to enforce, and she's wasted our dues chasing after personal vendettas. This isn't leadership. This is bullying. The room erupted. Margaret pounded her gavel, shouting for order, but the tide had turned. People who'd been silent for years were finally speaking up. Sarah brought up her bird feeder fine. Ben mentioned his boat cover. Mrs. Jenkins talked about repainting her shutters. One by one, neighbors stood and shared their stories, each one a nail in Margaret's coffin. For the first time in her reign, Margaret wasn't feared. She was laughed at, mocked, stripped of the authority she clung to. And she knew it. But even as she tried to shout everyone down, I wasn't done. Not yet. The room was boiling over, voices rising and falling like a storm tide. But I stayed steady. When Margaret's gavel cracked against the table again, I raised my hand and the room actually quieted. That's when I laid down the final card I'd been holding back. I spoke with the county myself. They confirmed the HOA has no authority over privately owned cabins, none. Which means every fine Margaret issued, every threat she made, was illegal. I placed the county's official letter right there on the table for everyone to see. A hush spread across the room as people craned their necks to read it. Margaret went pale, her mouth opening and closing like a fish yanked from water. The weight of years of intimidation had finally snapped, and in its place, freedom rushed in. Someone in the back started clapping, then another, and suddenly the whole room was on its feet, applauding, not for me, but for themselves, for the fact that they weren't scared anymore. Margaret's voice tried to cut through the noise, shrill and desperate, but it was useless. Her power had evaporated in an instant. A motion was called right there, a vote of no confidence. Hands shot up across the room, almost unanimous. The woman who once ruled by fear was stripped of her title in less than 5 minutes. I'll never forget the look on her face as she realized it was over. Not with a bang, but with a simple raising of hands. And me. I didn't gloat, didn't grin. I just leaned back, breathed deep, and let the relief wash over me. The cabin was mine. The land was mine. And my peace, my family's legacy, was finally safe. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood felt lighter, like a fog had finally lifted. People who once kept their heads down now walked the trails with their shoulders back, smiling freely. I noticed the smallest things. Away from a neighbor I'd barely spoken to in years, the sound of kids laughing as they chased each other by the lake, without Margaret storming over to demand they respect property lines. The air itself felt different, as if the trees and water had exhaled along with us. For the first time in as long as I could remember, life here wasn't about rules and punishments. It was about community. Barbecues started popping up on weekends, something Margaret had once called a fire hazard and banned. Now, the smell of grilling burgers and corn on the cob wafted down the lanes, neighbors inviting each other over without fear of fines for unauthorized gatherings. Porch lights glowed a little longer at night, conversation stretching out into laughter instead of whispers. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was ours again. The HOA, stripped of Margaret's iron grip, reorganized itself under new leadership, calm, reasonable, and transparent. For the first time ever, meetings weren't battlegrounds. They were problem-solving sessions. People showed up not out of fear, but because they wanted to. Budgets were explained clearly. Dues were actually used to improve the park, and decisions were made as a group, not dictated by one woman's vendetta. The transformation was almost surreal, like stepping into an entirely different neighborhood. And Margaret? She faded into the background. Her empire was gone, her voice reduced to just another bitter murmur. Sometimes I'd see her walking the trail alone, eyes cast down, the clipboard she once carried like a sword nowhere to be found. Neighbors who once scrambled to appease her now walked right past, barely offering a nod. The power she had clung to for years dissolved the moment the truth came to light, and with it, the fear she had thrived on. She wasn't a tyrant anymore, just a reminder of how fragile false authority can be. Looking back, I realized this fight was never just about one cabin or one woman's obsession with control. It was about something much bigger. The right to live without fear in a place you call home. Margaret's rules, her threats, her fines, they were never about safety or community. They were about power. And when power is built on intimidation, it only lasts as long as people stay silent. The moment we spoke up, the moment we stood together, her reign crumbled like dust. My cabin still stands, stronger than ever. Every time I run my hand along the porch railing my father built, or sit by the stone fireplace my grandfather laid rock by rock, I'm reminded of what was at stake and what was saved. It isn't just wood and nails. It's memory. It's legacy. It's a piece of my family that no one, not even Margaret with all her false authority, could ever take away. And yet, this victory wasn't mine alone. It belonged to every neighbor who found their voice that night. To Sarah, who refused to pay another fine for her bird feeder. To Ben, who finally got to cover his boat without a thread stuck to his windshield. To Mrs. Jenkins, who painted her shutters the color she loved, not the one she was ordered to use. Together, we didn't just protect my cabin, we reclaimed our freedom. So if you've ever been bullied by an HOA, or made to feel powerless in your own home, remember this story. Remember that sometimes the best revenge isn't shouting or fighting. It's shining a light on the lies and letting the truth do the heavy lifting. Bullies thrive in the dark, in the silence of fear. But when you step into the open, when you bring others with you, their grip weakens. That's how I saved my cabin, yes. But more importantly, that's how we saved each other. And every time I watch the sun sink over the lake, casting gold across the water, I can't help but smile. Because I know this place, this cabin, this community, is finally what it was always meant to be. Home.